welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you're here with us live, hello. If you're watching this recording, thanks for watching. We're here to celebrate the launch of Failed to Return, Canada's Bomber Command Sacrifice in the Second World War, edited by Keith Oglivie. I'm Monica, and I work with Heritage House Publishing, who is proud to publish this book. We publish books for both adults and young readers, and focusing on historical, social, political, and recreational subjects. If you want to keep in touch with us, follow our other books, any other events we're doing, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter or follow us on social media. All of those links are at heritagehouse.ca. I'm going to go over a bit of housekeeping, run of show, and then I'm going to hand it over to Keith to handle the event. There will be questions at the end if we've got time. So if you're on YouTube joining us live or Facebook, put those in the chat, and we will get to those when we can. So this event, although virtual, it does take place on the land of Indigenous peoples. Heritage House is located within the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, including the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation, the Malahat, Pacheedaht, Chianu, Sook, and Wasainik peoples. If you know the land whose territory you're on, let us know in the chat, or just let us know where you're joining us. We've got people from all over Canada and across the pond in UK, Steve here, who you'll meet in a moment. So share with us where you're joining from. So the event is being recorded. If you're watching this later, that's an obvious fact to you. But if you want to share it with friends, family, or rewatch later, you can definitely do that. As I mentioned, you can ask questions in the chat boxes on the Facebook or YouTube. And we highly encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. If you want a signed copy by Keith, you can get it from Tanner's Books. And you can also request personalization if you want it inscribed to a certain somebody, maybe for a holiday gift. So I'd now like to introduce Keith Oglivie. He's the editor of Failed to Return. Keith is a former aerospace engineer who worked on Canada's space program in the 70s and 80s before moving into the field of international development, supporting governance and economic development projects. He's also a former pilot who owned an ex-RCAF trainer, a sailor, an explorer, and the best-selling author of The Spitfire Luck of Skeets Oglivie, which Heritage House was proud to publish as well. So, Keith, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you for organizing this opportunity. It's wonderful. A virtual launch, as opposed to being there, is not ideal since we can't have face-to-face conversations that I think are important and I always enjoy. But on the other hand, this format has allowed us to bring in some very interesting people whose presence will make this a much more engaging event than it might be if you were forced just to listen to me. I'll introduce first Steve Darlow, who is, among other things, an author and contributor to the book with a couple of stories. He's a publisher in the UK and is very active in the events around Bomber Command in the UK, so he knows whereof he speaks. We're joined also by Kevin Windsor, who is the director of the excellent Canadian National Air Force Museum in Trenton, Ontario. You'll see Kevin in a moment is very particularly positioned to speak to the kinds of stories in this book. Dave Burrell is the chief archivist at the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton, Alberta, and is one of the primary sources for me of information and images for the book and research background material. We're hoping also to be joined by John McNary, who's the president of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan Museum in Brandon, Manitoba. I haven't been there, nor have I been to the Bomber Command Museum, although I hope to get to both places. The CATP Museum was also a source of some superb reference material that I used in my research. So I welcome all of these gentlemen. And each of them and their institutions has a direct connection to the book. And I hope they will be able to tell you about that in their own words. So first, a bit of background on the book. The contents of the book consists of 16 chapters of covering more than 70 airmen, Canadian airmen who served in the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command during the Second World War in both RCAF and RAF squadrons. Because the actions that these men participated in took place in Europe, I think we as a country tend to collectively remember Canada's contribution as much as we do anything else, and sometimes at the expense of the acknowledgement and understanding of the individual experiences and the price paid by each of these airmen who participated in the war. The book was, in the end, I think for that reason, an acknowledgement of what it took and the sacrifices that were made by all of the more than 40,000 Canadians who flew with the RAF Bomber Command during the war and the 10,000 who did not come home. The introduction to the book sets the context by describing first where the RCAF was and Canada was at the beginning of the war, with only a handful of pilots, about 245 if I remember, and not many more outdated aircraft. So ending the war was quite a change. We ended up with the fourth largest air force in the world. Quite an extraordinary genesis from an almost zero starting point. And the book also, the introduction also goes on to describe the Commonwealth Air Training Plan that underpinned this transformation and that eventually brought so many highly qualified and trained young men to into deadly combat. There are 15 stories with chapters with stories that have not been published in Canada but have been published in the UK before, and Steve will talk more about that. I added one chapter to tell the story of a local Canadian boy, Victoria boy, by the name of Teddy Blenkinsop, and I will talk more about him later as well. Although most of the men in this book did not return to their homes, many who did carried the scars of their experience for the rest of their lives. And as an illustration, I very recently received a very short email from a university colleague describing his own experience as a second generation survivor of these events. And I'd like to read it because it shows just how far the reach of the damage done by the depth of the cost of the participation of these men was during the war. Here it is in his own words. I visited the restored Halifax bomber in Trenton in the museum, and you'll see more on that shortly, and sat in the rear gunner seat where my father sat for 33 missions over Germany in 1944-45 as a 20-year-old pilot officer. It was cramped, no pressurization, cold at 25,000 feet. I tore my shirt getting in and out of the seat. They were shot down in the North Sea and everybody survived, probably a miracle and a good thing because I was born in 1947. He would never talk about it, his father would never talk about it, and finally was taken out of his business on a stretcher and classed as battle fatigue in an ambulance in 1969. The term PTSD didn't exist in those days. Hit the bottle for a long time and finally shot himself in 1983. He'd met his third grandson 6 months earlier. Did not have a good later life. Few friends. I wish he could have gone to the Legion and reminisced with his comrades. A very good father and a gentleman. My 4 siblings and I all miss him. I think that speaks eloquently to the value of telling these stories. So this book is, in that sense, is an act of remembrance for all of them, those who returned and those who didn't. And with that, I would like to first turn this over to Steve Darlow to tell you a bit more about the background to these stories. Steve.
Well, thank you, Keith, and thank you, Monica, for arranging the opportunity to talk about the book. So why the series? Well, firstly, I have an affinity towards the Canadian story in Bomber Command. My grandfather was a pilot with 427 Squadron and Halifax's, and then he was with 405 Squadron as a Pathfinder on Lancasters, and obviously he carried out the training in Canada. And his rear gunner, Donald Copeland, lost his life on a raid in May 1944, at which Arthur, my grandfather, became a prisoner of war, and I met my grandfather's bomb aimer, a chap called Alec Nethery. So I had an affinity towards the Canadian stories, and initially with my writing, I had the opportunity to speak to veterans, to record their stories, but they had the opportunity to tell their stories, and in researching some of my early books, I was traveling across Europe, across the UK, and you see in the cemeteries at the Reichsfeld Cemetery, the Rheinberg Cemetery, some of the cemeteries in Normandy, the Canadian cemeteries in Normandy. There are all these young men there who hadn't had the opportunity to tell their story. So obviously that got me thinking, and as a publisher, I could have that opportunity to tell their story. And if you go to the Squadron Operation Records book, and you'll see against crews, they have the takeoff time, and obviously they don't have a landing time. The ones that are missing, and against them is put into these diaries the term "fail to return." So "fail to return" became that series. And then, fortunately, through my publishing, I've been able to connect with some brilliant authors and researchers who also have a passion for the subject. And I approached them and said, would you consider contributing a story to the Fail to Return series? So we've published 6 volumes in the United Kingdom. So the authors that we've assembled for the book here is Dr. Steve Bond, and I recommend looking some of these authors up because they're quite prolific in the work that they're doing. Steve's doing some excellent post-war books at the moment. Lindsay Druce, now Lindsay Duncan. Lindsay goes around visiting crash sites and puts a terrific amount of work in collecting the stories that are behind those crash sites and researching them. Mark Hall has contributed. He's a brilliant researcher. He's written another book for me called Missing Presumed Murdered. He really has quite a sort of forensic way of researching into the stories. Sean Feast. Sean is another prolific Bomber Command author. He turns out some fantastic books, and he's an excellent writer as well. And he's got a particularly very good knowledge about Pathfinders. Dr. Robert Owen. Rob is the 617 Squadron official historian, and considerable knowledge just on the general story as a Bomber Command as well. So someone I often go to with respect to ideas. And then Howard Sandel has contributed, and Howard is the historian of 622 Squadron, because the book doesn't just focus on the Canadian squadrons. The Canadians served throughout the Royal Air Force, not just specifically for those Canadian squadrons. So, assembling these authors, we started to put together this series of books, and it was to tell sometimes the untold stories. We do have a book, Dam Busters Failed to Return, so we do tell some of the dam stories, but of course the men who never made it back didn't have the opportunity to tell their stories. But then we've told the stories about the V-Weapons campaign. We tell the story about the D-Day campaign. I think one of my chapters in the book is about some Canadians who lost their lives in supporting the invasion of Normandy, which is often a very much overlooked campaign that Bomber Command was involved in, and yet it was a significant contribution that it made. So and the Canadians, these young lads had crossed an ocean to fight in this country to liberate Europe for Nazism. They were prepared to do that. And you read the letters from these guys, and it really brings home, as we keep saying, how young they were, and yet they were willing to travel across an ocean to actually fight to this country. And I only think it's right that the lads who didn't have a chance to tell their story are now given that voice, and I hopefully we've done that. And then I know Keith because Keith and I met at Stalag Luft 3 a few years ago. I can't remember exactly, Keith. It was a few years ago when we were out there for a Great Escape anniversary, and I was fortunate enough to publish the biography of Keith's father, who was a great escaper and a Battle of Britain pilot. And then we got talking about the opportunity of making a specific book about the Canadian failed to return sacrifice. And Keith was very keen to take it on, to mould it more into a Canadian story for a Canadian audience, to give a lot more context to exactly what these men were letting themselves in for. So that's why I did, and it comes down to we will remember them, and we will. And this book certainly does that for the Canadian sacrifice. So that's the background to my involvement, Keith.
As well as writing a couple of the stories, Steve. Thank you so much. So let me introduce a bit more the other participants, who I think are representatives of the premier Canadian historical institutions with direct links to the stories in this book. The common element in their mandates, the common element in their mandates is the preservation of history and memory, I think, and each of the institutions has contributed to this book in various ways with information, images, support, for which I'm truly grateful in all respects. So I would like to turn this over now to the gentlemen who are waiting in the wings. The first one I'll invite to speak would be Dave Burrell, please, who is the Chief Archivist of the Bomber Command Museum in Nanton. You'll see in the background there one of their prized exhibits, the Lancaster, that they bring out on display every so often and actually start up on the ramp. Dave.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks for including me in your book launch. Yeah, just a bit of background. What we have here at the museum, on the front lawn, we have Canada's Bomber Command Memorial. It has 10,400 names on it, and all Canadians who were lost flying with Bomber Command. And we have the Lancaster that you see behind me, and a Blenheim bomber, and a Mosquito under restoration in our restoration hangar. So we've got 3 Bomber Command airplanes and a number of training aircraft, and a very focused museum. All we do is Bomber Command and the training plan that supported it. We've began way back in 1986, and it's just an all-volunteer museum. We get no operational funds from anybody, any order of government. So taking a long time to do things, but we're pretty proud of restoring Lancaster FM 159 to a taxiable aircraft, and we have 3 going on 4 or 5 other operational, or not operational, but runnable airplanes. I should also mention that we too publish books. We've done 3 notable biographies here. Ian Bazalgette, BC, the Canadian Victoria Cross recipient, and Big Joe McCarthy, the American in the Dams raid, who went on to become a Canadian, an RCAF chap. And then the most recent one, the biography of Johnny Fauquier, the most decorated RCAF airman ever, which we've written and published at the museum. But we're happy to contribute a bit anyway, not very much, I think, to Keith's book, primarily through the Blenkinsop story. And that's interesting because our involvement and connection to that dates back to 1992, when we didn't really, I mean, we just started the museum, and that was a long time ago. But we didn't know too much, I guess. But anyway, we managed to line up this guy named Reg Lane to be the guest speaker at our official opening of the museum building in 1992, and he did a great job, and we got to know Reg Lane and his background. And then a couple of years later, we have special events every year, and in 1994 we decided to have one salute to the Pathfinders, and we invited Reg Lane back again. And for our events, whenever we can, we create a museum display or commission a painting or something to go along with and to sort of unveil and have as a centerpiece for the event. And so we looked up and found out about the Monson raid, where Canadian, sort of the worst night ever for the RCAF squadrons. I think they lost 10 of 55 airplanes that went out that night, and 18%. So it was a horrible, horrible night. And we thought, well, we'll see if we can find something there to build a painting around, and that's how we were introduced to Blenkinsop. And so the painting that we had commissioned features, and it's in Keith's book, features Blenkinsop's aircraft and a Ju-88 about to come in and attack it, and Reg Lane is circling above as the sort of the master bomber on the Monson raid. And so Reg came and spoke again at that event and unveiled the painting for us. So that was pretty special, and we still got the display panels that went along with that. It's part of our Pathfinder display, and including the brief version of the Blenkinsop story. So that's a nice connection that we have to the book. And as well, we're very involved in the John Fraser story. And that's interesting because we were approached by John's daughter, who knew nothing at all about her father's story, and very little of anything related to the Dams raid or Bomber Command. And we got a note from her saying, my father was involved in the Dams raid, and I hear you're having a Dams raid event, and would you be interested in his story? And so we got to know Sheer Low very well through that. She's visited here a couple of times, and of course the John Fraser story, and it's all told here and in some of the books that we've published. And then Sheer and her mother Doris, as I say, were here a number of times, so it's nice to have that connection to Keith's book as well. So yeah, we really enjoyed looking through Keith's book. I really liked through the different stories. You get a real insight into all aspects of Bomber Command, the training and the OTUs and the various operations and the various experiences that the Canadians had in Bomber Command. And so the different stories, because they're different, introduce you to kind of all aspects of the Canadian Bomber Command experience. And also enjoyed the use of letters and quotations and original documents that Keith's worked into those. When I'm doing my books, I know that's what I try and get incorporated as much as possible. So those 2 points and the connections we have to the people involved in the story, we really enjoy the book and look forward to selling it in our gift shop.
Thanks very much, Dave. The next person I'd like to invite to speak is Kevin Windsor, who is the director of the National Air Force Museum in Trenton. I met Kevin on a tour I did with my first book, and Kevin and his colleagues were very supportive, and I think they kind of have for me a particular place because I think there's a stone in commemoration of my father. It's part of your path of remembrance outside the museum. So, Kevin, please.
Welcome. So thanks, Keith, for having me. We did meet when you were promoting Spitfire Luck, and I got to read the story about your dad Skeets and your mom Irene. At the National Air Force Museum, we have a recreation of Hut 104, which is where the Great Escape took place, and we actually have one of Skeets' uniforms here in the museum. So when Keith asked me to do this, I thought it was a fantastic opportunity. I was going to talk to you all from outside, looking at the Halifax bomber, but we have a school group in right now which are learning about principles of flight. They're a little noisy running around, so I thought, what a better opportunity than to take you inside the Halifax bomber. So I'm sitting in the navigator's seat inside the Halifax bomber, which is here at the National Air Force Museum of Canada. So you can just sort of see what it's like inside. Dave, maybe you could go inside the Lancaster. We could compare seats of what it's like. We were talking beforehand about just how spacious a Halifax is compared to a Lancaster bomber. But that was the beginning workhorse for Bomber Command. There was the Wellingtons, Lancasters, but the Halifaxes were really the workhorse of it. Not to take anything away from Dave and the Lancaster guys in Nanton. We also have a Lancaster here at the National Air Force Museum, which is KB882 from Edmundston, New Brunswick, which we've been restoring for 3 years now, and hopefully have that unveiled for April of 2024 for the Air Force Centennial. But what Keith had asked us to talk about was the primary mission of the museum. And the mission of the museum is to provide a memorial for those in the Air Force who sacrificed their lives in service of Canada. And what more fitting memorial we can have than to look at a Lancaster and to look at a Halifax and to see the aircraft that they served in, that they flew in, that the ground crew worked on, and that a lot of these guys called their office. We're blessed to have so many veterans who have been able to come in and travel in through the Halifax and to see their old seats, to bring back memories, which we try to record as much as we can. We've had veterans who have come in and their children and grandchildren have said, Grandpa never talks about the war. And when they finish and they leave from the aircraft, we've heard back later that they have told their stories for hours afterwards, and that their children and grandchildren have just been able to recount those stories, to listen to them for the first time, all from just sitting inside the Halifax bomber and seeing what it was like and trying to share those experiences with their children and their grandchildren. So I think Fail to Return is a great memorial to that as well. To hear the stories of those who didn't come back, those who weren't able to come back and tell their stories to their children, that we can capture those stories and that we can learn those stories, and then we can share those stories so that we and generations will always remember them.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate that. I think John McNary, unfortunately, from the CATP Museum in Brandon, has not been able to join us. But his museum, as I said, has been the sort of third support, I think, for this book as well, in terms of research materials, that kind of thing. And the museum, like those in the Bomber Command Museum and the National Air Force Museum, has a collection of period aircraft that is quite amazing, including some flying versions of the same airplanes that these Bomber Command pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners flew in during their training 80 years ago. So if you're in Brandon, it's worth seeing it, just like the ones in Nanton and Trenton. So I would like to take a couple of minutes just to read a passage from the Teddy Blankensop story that I think a couple of us have talked about. Um, Teddy, this chapter follows Squadron Leader Teddy Blankensop's particular path through the BCATP to advanced training assignments as an instructor in Canada and New Zealand, and ultimately to a position as a decorated bomber pilot in North Africa and the UK, where he was assigned to the RCAF's 405 Pathfinder Squadron, of which Reg Lane, who Dave referred to, was the commanding officer at the time. This reading covers his final mission, or at least the start of it. And it begins with the crew's arrival for lunch on April 27th, 1944, where the Blankensop crew were informed that Larry Allen, who is their navigator, had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the third in the crew. They also discovered they were on the duty roster for that night in their customary aircraft, S for Sugar, leading a secondary raid over Monson, France, as backup to Wing Commander Reg Lane, the designated master bomber. For Teddy and most of his crewmates, it was their 40th operation over enemy territory. Teddy and his crew took off from Granston Lodge 1 minute after midnight. With Reg Lane, they made it to the target unmolested and began to set out the visual bombing markers. The main force bomber stream arrived shortly after, heavily harassed by enemy night fighters, flak, and the ever-probing searchlights. Lane continued to provide direction to ensure the needed accuracy, resulting in significant damage to the Monson rail yards. As the attack ended around 1:45, Lane directed Teddy and his crew to return to base. Mission accomplished, and Lane's crew turned to follow shortly thereafter. At the end of the returning bombing stream, Lane witnessed several aircraft shot out of the sky by the marauding night fighters, mostly employing the deadly Strega Musik upward-firing cannon that allowed the attackers to close in below their victims without being seen. About 20 minutes after turning away from the target, he saw a massive explosion some 10 miles ahead, with colored pyrotechnic markers filling the sky. I quote from Lane, "I knew immediately that it was Teddy Blankensop's aircraft, as we were the only two bombers carrying those specific colors. Judging from the size of the explosion, I reported that there was absolutely no chance of any survivors." Pending formal confirmation of this assessment, Teddy and his crew were listed as missing. As the first shells pounded through the aircraft from below and the bomber's remaining payload began to ignite, Teddy put the nose down and tried to keep his doomed aircraft stable. At about 300 feet, S for Sugar finally exploded and disintegrated. Only 3 of the crew seemed to have been able to leave the blazing wreck at low altitude. The first of the crew recovered had jumped without a parachute, with the inevitable results. The second came down very close to the final point of impact and was later reported by local witnesses to have survived his low-level exit with serious injuries, only to be shot by his captors. The third was George Smith, who was picked up, also seriously injured, by the local Black Shirts, the Nazi collaborator organization, and taken to a German hospital in nearby Diest. An RCAF War Crimes Investigation Unit later determined that he had been locked in a room, denied medical attention, food, and drink for 3 days, and subsequently died from his injuries. The bulk of the wreckage and the balance of the crew, with the exception of Teddy, came down just west of the town of Webkom in Belgium. The locals, those who were not associated with the Black Shirts, were respectful and sympathetic in dealing with the fallen airmen, and the casualties were laid out in state in the parish hall and later buried in the town churchyard. Unaware of the circumstances of the rest of his crew, Teddy regained consciousness on the ground near his open parachute. Miraculously, he had been blown clear as the Lancaster's fuselage came apart in the final explosion. His parachute had somehow opened in time to break his fall, and his full body hurt. He had lost his boots, but he found himself more or less intact. The commotion of enemy search parties and dogs soon motivated him to distance himself from the burning remains of his aircraft. He almost immediately ran into a sympathetic couple who gave him some water, farmer's clothes, and a pair of clogs, and then led him to a nearby wood. Determined not to be caught, Teddy decided to strike out on his own, heading south until exhaustion overcame him. Hungry, cold, and in need of a medical help for a painful shoulder injury, he fell asleep in a haystack. There he was discovered by another sympathetic farmer who gave him food and water, then contacted local members of the resistance. By now, his parachute had been discovered, and the local forces knew there was an airman on the run. On enemy soil, Teddy now had to rely on the skills and daring of others. So that's from the chapter on Teddy Blenkinsop. The chapter goes on to describe how Teddy spent the night and the next 3 months on the run with the help of the resistance, only to be captured by the Gestapo in a massive sweep of the town in which he was then hiding. Teddy was denied prisoner of war treatment because of the circumstances of his capture and ultimately shipped off to the Neuengamme concentration camp, given insufficient food, clothing, and forced to carry out heavy manual labor. He eventually succumbed to tuberculosis and died in January 1945 in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. His memory is now preserved in a special corner of the village near which his doomed aircraft came down. And a story I find is particularly sad in a way, having survived that disastrous explosion, but died in the end due to the circumstances under which he was recaptured. I found it nonetheless exemplary of the commitment and the bravery and sacrifice of so many of his comrades, and that makes it so important to put on the record here in Canada. So I'm not sure if there are any other topics. I think Monica said that nobody's indicated they have any questions, but I wonder if one of the points that Steve made was that the crews that we talk about in this book are really mixed crews. They're a mixture of airmen from throughout the Commonwealth and in particular the Britain's own training program as well as the Canadian training program. Steve, I wonder if you might talk just a minute or two about how the crews formed up and how they kind of welded together as comrades.
Yes, well, obviously, quite early on in the war, it became clear that to train as many aircrew as were planned, it wouldn't be able to do it over the blacked out conditions and the hostile skies of this country. So the Commonwealth Air Training Plan had come into existence, and the various trades would go off across seas to the prairies, for example, to carry out their training. And veterans actually, Keith, they do say to me when they first arrived in Canada, they were treated to wonderful food. They would have these tables full of lovely bread and jams and all this kind of, and they absolutely adored it. But then unfortunately, when they got to the actual stations, they were back on RAF rations, which didn't go down particularly well with them. But they were certainly very, very well received. But then once they come back to the UK, you need to form this crew. And as Keith, you were saying, it's very much a multinational force from the Commonwealth, but also that the countries that are allied to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth as well. And they had quite a remarkable system of forming crews together. So they would get the various trades, and this was often happened at an operational training unit, where they were often they would be flying the Wellington bombers, so they'd be forming their crew of 5, and they would put the various trades into a hangar. So you'd have the pilot, the bomb aimer, navigator, your wireless operator, and an air gunner at this stage when they're at OTU. And basically they were just told to sort themselves out and get on with it. So, you'd have 10 of each and say, sort yourselves into a crew. And it was it seems quite a bizarre way of doing it when you look back at it now, but I'm told that it was remarkably effective. But of course, the guys who tell you that it was remarkably effective are the ones that survived. But there was you always get, when you're talking to veterans, this extraordinary crew bond that was formed between people who from all over the world. And just as we're talking about operational training unit, one of the extremely sad statistics is the number of casualties that happened at OTU. Approximately 8,000 aircrew lost their lives in training incidents. Not too far from where I live is an operational training unit at number 11 OTU at Steeple Morden, and at Bassingbourn Cemetery there are Canadian lads in the cemetery there who lost their lives in training incidents. They'd been through all the training, crossed the Atlantic, formed up as a crew, and then sadly lost their lives there. It was then that they would go to a heavy conversion unit to the 4 engines, and usually they'd pick up their second air gunner and a flight engineer. And it's quite common that you'll see in Canadian crews that the flight engineer is British, and the rest of the crew may well be Canadian. But it's wonderful to see. Well, I'm sure Dave's probably experienced it as well, when you see the veterans get together and the years come off them, and that crew camaraderie that is there, and all the dreadful jokes come out, and all come out as well. But as we've said about this book, Keith, that's people we get the chance to meet, people we get the chance to interview, and these young lads were the same as them. I mean, the cover of your book, I think it's quite a remarkable cover. I mean, you just look at Teddy. I mean, he looks so young and so happy, and then you've just told us the story about what actually happened to him, and it's good that we're keeping going with him storing. So I think I went a bit off track there about the camaraderie, Keith, but I think it's something we cherish. It's certainly something that my grandfather's crew cherished, that friendship.
I think the fellow on the cover is Teddy Blankenshop, and I remember the story of his crewing up. I don't know if you ever had heard that, Dave, but when he crewed up, I think he was very systematic about it, very careful about the folks that he'd been observing during the course of the training at OTU, and so he had made up his mind about the maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people that he wanted to approach above all else. He wanted a first-class navigator in particular, and that was near and dear to his heart because he himself was qualified as both a pilot and as an advanced navigator. So he was in that. Do you have any similar stories from Johnny Fokier's book, Dave? He must have gone through the same thing, although he was more senior, I guess.
Well, actually, Johnny didn't. Johnny did a lot of flying as a bush pilot in Quebec prior to joining the Air Force. So when he joined the Air Force, he had thousands of hours, and so they immediately made him an instructor, and he instructed for a year prior to finally, and I'm pretty sure he wanted to get out of the instructing, as most instructors did, and then he went across to the UK, and he was initially put into some special. I've forgotten some of this because I haven't read my book lately, but he was put into some special group, and then I don't really recall his OTU experience, but I think it was different from the others. I think he might have just gone directly to 405 Squadron because of the vast experience that he had already. But no, Johnny was quite a guy. And when Steve mentioned the OTUs, and the dangers there flying those clapped out Wellingtons, the little point that always comes to mind is when we originally engraved the 10,643 names onto our Bomber Command, Canada's Bomber Command Memorial out here in the front lawn. Exactly 10%, 1,064 of those names were OTU casualties. So that speaks to Steve's point about how dangerous it was on the OTUs. And of course, we've heard that from many veterans here as well.
Go ahead.
And it wasn't just the fact that they were clapped out Wellingtons as well, Dave. I said not too far from here is the Steeple Morden Airfield, and you had earlier in the war you had German intruder aircraft coming over. So some of these lads would have been on long night flying exercises coming into land, and there would be German intruders positioned that would just come in and take them out. Terrible.
Just point of interest maybe is we mentioned Johnny Fauquier. He of course was involved in 617 Squadron as the commanding officer at the end of the war, dropping the Grand Slam bombs. And you can see in the background underneath our Lancaster is our replica Grand Slam bomb, and it was put together for in anticipation of a special event that we had all organized for 2020, which was going to be a salute to Johnny Fauquier, which corresponded to the publishing of my biography, as well as the creation of the 22,400-pound bomb, which we were going to put into the bomb bay of the Lancaster for the events. And of course, that event was canceled with COVID. And but we're hoping, there's a meeting tomorrow night here when we're planning to have some events in 2022, and we hope to get that event reorganized and unveil sort of that Grand Slam bomb that you can see in the background.
I have a picture that I think I shared with the museum digitally of Johnny Fauquier sitting on top of one of those things with a big smile on his face.
Yes, yeah, that's in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he was a pretty interesting character.
Great. So, Kevin, I'm not sure whether there were any remarks you wanted to add at the end. Your choice of location is wonderful, and I think it probably gives a more immediate sense of what it's like, or must have been like for these guys when they got in. Unfortunately, it was night after night that they did this, and I just still am not in a position to even imagine how they managed to pull together the courage and will to do that so frequently.
It's always an emotional time being inside one of these bombers. When you get to meet in here with veterans and they want to tell you their story, and many times they say, they apologize and they say, oh, I'm sure you have other things that you'd much rather be doing, or you have more important things to do, and we always tell them that there's nothing more important than hearing their stories. Even if we close the museum and everybody is gone and they still want to stay, we'll just stay here as long as they want to continue telling their stories.
I think that's a wonderful example of the importance of all of these facilities, and collecting the stories, as Steve has mentioned, is really a critical part of that, and that's something that the museums do admirably well. So I think Monica has indicated there might be a couple of questions. Please go ahead and go. how many of the Canadians served in the RAF, uh, and I'm not sure about the last part of that question. Um, there were, my recollection is that there were 77,000 plus. I actually, unfortunately, John would have been better to answer this question, but I think there were 77,000 graduates of the BCATP who were Canadian. There were about 135,000 graduates in all, representing all of the Commonwealth. And those 77,000 went on to serve in the RAF. Most of it, you have to remember, was later in the war, as the air training plan, which didn't start until early 1940, got geared up. It wasn't until maybe 42 or 43 that the bulk of the graduates started actually arriving in England, and that was when the air war was really heating up, particularly Bomber Command's activities. Um, so because Canada didn't really have an air force of any substance at the beginning of the war, when the graduates went over to England, they were more often than not enlisted. They're still in the RCAF, but they were more often than not enlisted in bomber bomber command's English squadrons, British squadrons. Dave, do you remember what year it was that the first Canadian bomber squadron was actually established within Bomber Command?
That's 405 Squadron in
Yeah.
1941.
41. Okay. Yeah.
But
So there was one squadron, and then it.
I was going to say what we tell people here is that there were more Canadians served in RAF squadrons than served in RCAF squadrons.
Yeah, and in the ultimately there was I think what am I thinking of? There was a number of uh, British, as Bill had, as Steve has pointed out, there were a lot of British members of the Canadian 6 group who were ultimately established in Bomber Command. So that was just the inverse of the great presence of Canadians in RAF squadrons.
Yes, early on there were a lot of RAF people in Canadian squadrons, and as I guess Steve mentioned, the flight engineers, almost all the flight engineers were Brits. So you often see in the Canadian squadron 6 Canadians and 1 Brit, and he's the flight engineer.
So Sean Feast, who has contributed one of the stories in the book, great story, asks why Canadians were allowed their own number 6 group in Bomber Command when the Australians were denied the same. Part of that answer, I think, is political. Part of it has to do with the sheer number of Canadians who were going over there. There were the political part was that the Prime Minister of the time, Mackenzie King, was adamant that Canada would be recognized for its independent contribution to both the Commonwealth Air Training Plan and to the war effort. With respect to the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Canada ended up paying for almost all of that. It was in the billions of dollars in those days dollars. So you can imagine the cost now. The scale of that contribution was such that I think it was very difficult, despite the disinclination of the leaders of the bombing command hierarchy of the day to deny eventually that Canada should have its own presence. So they allowed the creation of number 6 group. I think 405 was the first squadron, if not one of the first to join that group, and it gradually built up. That is described to some extent in the book here, but by in the early days, the number 6 group suffered disproportionate casualties for a number of reasons. They didn't have the training, they didn't have the experience, they didn't have the aircraft that the more established RAF squadrons had. But they quickly built themselves up and ended the war with a very good record. So thanks for that question. Are there other examples from people of other countries serving in the RCF? Well, Australians, certainly, all of the Commonwealth. Teddy Blenkinsop actually went to New Zealand to help them set up an advanced navigators school, and then transferred through Canada to the UK to join the campaign in North Africa and in Europe. We with respect to the second part of the question, do we know anything about First Nations people serving in the RCF? That may be actually a better question for Kevin, who unfortunately has had to leave us because he was running out of juice. He doesn't have a plug-in in the Halifax, so he's had to go. And I don't have an answer. It's an interesting one. I know there has been increasing recognition of the roles that First Nations people played, and I know there were some in the RCF, but I just don't know their stories, I'm afraid. Good question, maybe a topic for another book.
I mean, in respect of nationalities, Keith, I mean, the International Bomber Command Centre here in the UK have been doing a terrific amount of research on casualties, and you know, and certainly amending what have been official figures up to now. But I think we're sort of getting up into the 60, 70, 80 sort of nationalities that are represented in regard to Bomber Command, because it's not just the Commonwealth, it's Polish, French, Norwegian, those squadrons. So it is absolutely a multinational force. And certainly when at memorial services, we recently had the Bomber Command Memorial Service over here in the UK at the Green Park, and we get as many representatives as we can from the nationalities to come along and lay the wreaths and pay their respects. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Monica, I think we're probably almost out of time. It's been a great discussion, and I thank you, gentlemen, thoroughly.
I'm muted. It's been fabulous, and I really enjoyed hearing from so many people and their expertise. And I'm sure our audience did too. So thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you, Steve, Kevin, Dave, and of course, Keith, who pulled this all together. If you want to get the book, it's called Failed to Return. Signed copies are available from Tanner's Books, and you can actually request a signed inscription. I'll put the information on the screen there if you want Keith to sign your book. If you aren't in the neighborhood of Tanner's Books, or if shipping isn't possible, it's available in all the regular outlets online. And if you can also ask your local bookstore to order it if you want to patronize your local independent bookseller. I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, there's not much else that I have to say. So if there's anyone you want to thank, or any final remarks, Keith, I'll let you finish up.
No, just want to emphasize how grateful I feel to Steve for his contribution of articles and for support in organizing this, and to Dave for his access to the material that the Bomber Command Museum provided. It's been so much easier just because of all of that support, and I really thank you a great deal. Thanks for organizing this, Monica. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll sign us off. Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.